My name is William Lawrence, and I hired on the New York Central Railway in 1951. And they used the railway at that time, or I guess still do, would hire the high school students and university students for 3 or 4 months in the summer. And then after 3 or 4 months, they go back to school, but anyway, you get 3 or 4 months of work out of it, which was well paid at the time. Well, I lived over there on 43 Jonas Street, or 41 Jonas Street, where the sports club is now, was where I was born and raised. My father worked on the Michigan Central. He hired on in 1922, and he worked for 40 years. And anyway, through him, I might have got the job in the summertime because I was pretty young. So I hired on the New York Central in 1951, and for the summer. In 1952, I got hired on again for the summer, and I worked in the freight shed here in the New York Central. And I didn't know it at the time, but it was all fixed up with my dad, got me the job. In 1953, I decided I wanted to be on the train crews because I had an uncle and a cousin and whatever worked on the Wabash Railroad. So I went over there and applied for a job in 1953 as a trainman or a brakeman, and eventually they hired me. It takes about 6 or 7 weeks to get processed to even go to work. So I write all the rules and your examinations and medical and whatever. Then you got to make trial trips, and we were supposed to go to work on the way freight at the time the Wabash had. Well, it come fall when we were supposed to go to work, rather than let the new men go on the job, the Wabash give the way freight to the CNR. Well, and I didn't go to work only at around Christmas time in 53. Then I went to work in 54, regular on the Wabash. And I worked up I worked from 1954 to 1960 as on the train crews. Most of the time, or a lot of the times, down on Niagara Falls in the swing job, run from Niagara Falls into Fort Erie back and forth. Worked 7 days a week, 365 days a year. No days off, believe it or not. And it was an outpost job, as they call it. Well, in the first of 1960, the Norfolk and Western bought the Norfolk and Western bought the Wabash, and they doubled the size of the trains and laid half of the men off, which I was one. So then the guys that laid off, we had railroad experience, we swung right over onto the CNR because they were qualified men to go to work. So we went we done the same thing with CNR, wrote the rules and whatever. We went to work in the CNR, and I worked in the CNR from 1960 until 1993. So total time I worked on the railroad roughly 41 years. And then after I retired from the railroad, then I went over to the museum and helped them with the museum. And I think I spent more time or more hours and done more work for the museum than I did when I got paid, when I worked for the railroad. They had brought that 5700 in at the time. At that time I was a general yard master and worked out of St. Thomas. And the Toronto phoned me up one day, and there was two of us. There was a train master, the general yard master, which is the same job almost. So my boss phoned me up and he said, "We got to have a man to work on Saturday." And I said, "Oh, that's too bad." He said, "Well, do you know who it is?" And I said, "No." He said, "It's you." He said, "We got to bring a steam engine in from Ottawa, and we got to have somebody to look after it. Be over, make sure everything's all right." So they said, the steam engine will be in here at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning on Saturday morning. And I said, okay. So I sit around Saturday, and the steam engine didn't show up. I kept phoning the dispatcher, and I find out they're getting delayed here and delayed there, you know, coming from Toronto. So finally they got in here into London, and once it left London, it come under my jurisdiction. So the train master in London was supposed to change crews in London and put a new crew on to bring it over to St. Thomas. So, but anyway, the train master didn't do it. He was trying to save a little money. So the crew has to work 10 hours before they can book rest and quit. So the guys were only 9 hours on duty when they got to London. So he pushed them on to St. Thomas. Now it becomes my problem. So I knew the crews real well because I worked with those guys. So they arrived in St. Thomas around 8 o'clock at night, and I knew them all very well. And I said to them, they said, where do you want us to put this engine? This is a yard over there by Hiawatha Street. I said, I said, where do you want us to put it? And I said, I want you to put it here. I got to take it over over to New York Central, or the Conrail or whatever. And they said, oh, we're all done, we're all done. And I said, we haven't had no supper, and we hadn't did this and that. I said, look at here. I said, it'll only take you a half an hour. You bring it over there to New York Central, and I said, I'll buy your dinner, which I could do. So anyway, I talked them into it, and we brought it over here. And Toronto told me when it come to St. Thomas, just open up the doors, shove it inside, lock the doors, and tell the people to go home. And I said, I live in St. Thomas, and they're all friends of mine. So anyway, they brought the engine over, and I said to them, there's 50 or 60 people here wanting a news meeting, everybody else wants to look at this engine. They said, well, that's your problem, you do as you want. So they brought it in, and I sent the crew home in a taxi and left the engine here. And there was Bill Turvey. He rode in, he was a president of the museum at the time. He rode out of Toronto on the steam engine, and he promised me that he would sit with the steam engine all night and make sure people didn't vandalize it. And then the thing sit there all night, and I guess a dozen people sit there with it. Next Sunday there had to be 100 or 200 people come around, ooh and ah, over this engine. And about 5 o'clock on Sunday, I phoned an engineer in St. Thomas, and we got the diesel out that they brought it over with, and we shoved it inside and locked the door, and then everybody went home. That was the one. That's the story on the 57, on the 5700. Well, when I retired, they had this number 9, which was this little steam engine, and they had it down at Nanticoke, down at the hydro plant down at Nanticoke. And anyway, I'll try to shorten the story up a bit. They had this. They were down. They had this steam engine down there, and the engineers and the electrical people down at the Nanticoke got the engine, and they were going to fix it all up and use it for a display. So they took it down there. None of those men worked on the railroad. So they took it inside of the plant, and they started tearing it apart, and they took it all apart, and they literally had a big elevator, and they took it up on the second floor, and they tore it all apart. And when they got it apart, and maybe in 100 different pieces or more, then they didn't know how to put it back together because half the stuff was wore out. So they pushed it over in the corner, and they just left it there, and a lot of the guys lost interest in it, and there this thing's sit in a great big pile of scrap. So finally one day some top officials for the hydro come down and went a tour on the plant, and they said up on the second floor, and they said, what's that pile of scrap over there in the corner? It looks like an old engine. They said, yeah, it is. I said, what's it doing here? So they told them why it was up there, and they said, where's the guys that were going to fix it? They said, oh, we retired. So get that thing the hell out of here. Phone up the scrap dealers and tell them to take it away. So they got a hold of Ontario's Don Broadbeer and the Restoration Society, and they said, if you give it to the Restoration Society, we'll pick it all up and we'll bring it here to the museum, and back in the shop we'll try and put it together, because everybody back there was retired railroad men, mechanics and everything else. So I just retired on the CN, so I still had a few connections on there. And I talked to him and I said, I got a steam engine down in about 100 parts sitting in Nanticoke, and I want to bring it to St. Thomas. And the St. Thomas CNR had a way freight used to run every day down to Cayuga and back. Yeah, and it was a way freight. And I knew the crew on there very well. And I talked to the train master at the time in St. Thomas, and I told him my story, and I said, I want to bring it up here. And he said, oh God. And I said to him, we got the cars. We got 2 flat cars off of Port Stanley Railroad and 2 gondolas and a box car, like 5 cars. And we took it down to Nanticoke, and the men down at Nanticoke loaded all those parts of that engine on 5 cars. And then they got a hold of us and said, everything's ready to pull to go back to St. Thomas. So now I had to go back to the train master and tell him, I got to get that car, I got to get those 5 cars out of Nanticoke. He said, Bill, don't tell me about it. He said, do what you got to do. He said, I don't want to know about it. So I talked to the conductor and engineer on the way freight, and one Saturday, I think it was, we left St. Thomas, and I went with him. And Roy Broadbear went with me, because he was an engineer. He was a classified engineer on the CNR, and he was still working. So we both got on the way freight, and we rode down to Jarvis, and Nanticoke's about 10 miles further down the track. So we talked to the crew, and we said, you don't need 2 engines to run the Cayuga. So you guys give us one of those engines. You take the other engine and run the Cayuga and get 2 or 3 cars they had to pick up. And Roy and I would take the other engine. We run into Nanticoke with it and picked up the 5 cars. And we'll be back here about the same time as you are, at the same time you come back. So we run into Nanticoke. We inspected the cars and whatever, they were all inspected. We hooked on them and pulled out. As there's a way freight was coming back, we doubled the 5 cars onto the way freight, hooked the 2 engines together, and we brought the 5 cars over to St. Thomas here. And when they come into St. Thomas, we split the engines again, and Roy and I brought the 5 cars over to the museum here, and then Roy and I took the engine back over to St. Thomas Yard and coupled it back on the engine. And that's how the number 9 come. But number 9 is in at least, 100 or more pieces. It's unbelievable. And I looked at it and I said, there's no way this thing will ever be put together again. So we put it in the shop, and there's maybe we got a dozen guys working on it, and it took us 4.5 years to put that thing together. And a lot of what was wore out, we had got somebody to make a new one. And 4.5 years later, we steamed it up and run it outside the door, and we run it around a little bit. And finally, after we had the thing running perfect, we got the Board of Transport to come down, and they certified it, because everything was certified that you could run it. It was safe to operate. So then after that, we had 3 or 4 coaches that the Restoration Society had, passenger coaches, and we used to take and hook onto that engine with the permission of the Conrail, and we'd run it up on the Conrail main line down to the end of the city where the bridge was on Sunset Drive and back here. We'd run that on maybe on 2 or 3 times a month in the summer on a Sunday, and then after that, once everybody wanted the steam engine, and for the next 5 or 6 years, we took that number 9 and we traveled all over this part of Ontario. Took it to Windsor and went to down to Stratford and down all in through that area up to Godrich. And it was all volunteers, all retired railroad men. We had a fantastic time with it.
Tell me a bit more about the Restoration Society, like how it was formed, what some of the projects were, and its full name.
Okay, well, they had, when they took the Elgin County Restoration Society, I think that was the name of it. It was a Restoration Society. No, Locomotive Restoration Society it was. I don't know where that name come, but they got a charter for it, and they owned that name. And there was, there was a dozen guys, all retired, and there were, I'm talking machinists, every trade you can imagine on the railroad, and they were all in their 60s, 65, maybe the odd 170. And Don Broadbear had restored two or three steam engines previous, so he really had the knowledge. So under Don Broadbear's jurisdiction and the knowledge of the other men, they put that steam engine. Gord Tuck was another guy. I don't know whether you know Gord Tuck or not, but Gord Tuck was into the big steam engine thrash machines, and he helped an awful lot on restoring that engine. And like I say, we worked on that thing 4 and 5 days a week, 6 or 8 hours a day, and it took us literally 4.5 hours, 4.5 years, and we finally got it, painted it, and it literally rebuilt the whole thing. And when we got done with it, it looked like and operated like a brand new engine. So anyway, we run it around a few hundred miles around the area. Everybody wanted to go here or there, and the same railroad. They were all retired railroad people. And when we run it around, we'd always get their train orders, and we'd take it just like it was a railway, like the railway it is. It was all done through the dispatchers and the whole bit. We had a fantastic time with that engine. Carried hundreds and hundreds of people on it. Then Essex Terminal originally bought that engine brand new in 1923. And I forget the exact year, but I'd say 15 years ago. When the number 9 was in its peak condition in operation, and we had 5 or 6 coaches by that time, all reconditioned. We could handle 400 or 500 people if we had to. So Essex Terminal got a hold of us and said, they got a hold of us the year before and said, next year's our 100th anniversary. And we originally bought that engine brand new in 1923. And it's our 100-year anniversary. Is there any way we could have you bring that number 9 back to Windsor, and we could use it for a display and whatever, because we would really think a lot of that engine. And as I say, the engine looked like it was brand new when we got done with it. So we talked it over, and we said, well, we got to get it down to Windsor. Now that time, the main line on the Conrail, or the CNR, I guess it was, at that time CNR bought it, and the trains would run. You could run the tracks right to Windsor. So we said to Essex Terminal, CNR wouldn't let us run that train down to Windsor on our say-so. So we said to Essex Terminal, the management there, you make the arrangements with the CNR and get their permission, and with their permission, we'll run that train to Windsor, and then transfer it over onto the Essex Terminal, and we take it down there for a week. So the Essex Terminal set it all up with the CNR, but the CNR had to put a pilot engine on it in case we broke down, and the CNR also supplied the pilots, to operate, to work with us. I mean, we really didn't need them because we're all retired. But anyway, that was the way the rules went. So we took it down to Windsor, and we pulled it in right next. We put it right into the Essex Terminal yard, and I think we had 6 coaches with us. And the steam engine operator, we operated all the way to Windsor, just that the diesel was down there, and the diesel just would idle. And we took it to Windsor, and we took a carload of coal with us, because coal was kind of hard to come by, soft coal. So we got it down there to Windsor and pulled it into the Essex Terminal yard, and we parked the train right beside. There's a great big club down there, like a big, some kind of a big club, a private club, and it would maybe you could go in there 300 or 400 people on the weekend and go in and have dinner. So we parked it just outside of there on a track at Essex Terminal. So the deal was with the Essex Terminal, to my knowledge, that we took the engine down there and we could run the engine once a day over their tracks and back, loaded with passengers, whichever people wanted to ride, and any money we made we would go back into the repairs of the equipment for the Restoration Society. So we didn't think we'd get many passengers, but Essex Terminal put it in the paper every day for about a month that they were going to have this week's anniversary. So unknown to us, we had 100 or more people every day to ride, so they made quite a few dollars. The money that we owed everybody restoring that engine, we paid off the bills. And in the deal with the Essex Terminal was the seventh day we were there, Essex Terminal would have the use of that engine. We would man it, because we were experienced on but they could tell us they would want it for a reason or whatever. They wanted to fill it with their people and whatever. And we said, that's fine. You can have it for the seventh day. We'll operate it, but we would take it. So anyway, the seventh day we all went down there, and talked. We're all ready to go. And I said, where's all these people? We're supposed to leave at 2 o'clock. Said they're all into this big club having their dinner. So anyway, we had the engine sitting there all ready to go and had all the steps down. And the people come pouring out of that club. There must have been 300 or 400 of them, and they got on the engine. They got on the coaches, filled all the coaches, and we're all just about ready to leave because we're due out at, say, at 2:30. And I'm standing there at the back, the last coach on the, because I was the conductor, and waiting to get ready to go. And the guy from the Essex Terminal, the manager or whoever was running that operation for the day for Essex Terminal, come back to me and he said, I got better tell you. He said, we're going out with this year. We're going about 15 or 20 miles down their track. I forget where it was. They said about 10 miles out of town we're going to have a train robbery. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, we're going to have a train robbery. We're going to have some guys who are going to rob this train. I said, well, tell me about it. I said, I don't know nothing about this. This is 10 minutes before we're ready to leave. And we got 300 or 400 people on this coaches. And I said, what do you do? So he said, what we're going to do, we thought we would do. He said, we got 2 or 3 people, and he said, we got a 1932, or I think a 1932 coach, Chev car, wooden spokes and the whole bit. And we went to anyway, they got a couple of guys with these old Tommy guns they use in movies, and we're going to rob the train. And I said, well, how are you going to rob the train? 10 miles out, we'll be doing 20 or 25 miles an hour. They ain't going to stop that train, and they're going too fast. They can't get on. He said, they're going to take this whole car, and they're going to park it across the railroad tracks out there by a golf course. And I said, well, you better get up there and tell that engineer, because if he sees an old car in the tracks and 2 guys beside there with a couple of Tommy guns, he's going to pull that throttle back, and there isn't going to be much left of that car, because he isn't going to stop. He said, we're up there talking to him now. So anyway, you guys are crazy. So anyway, we get booting her down the tracks about 10 miles, and finally we come to the area where they said, and the train comes to a stop, and I'm on the back end, and I looks out, and here's the car sitting on the crossing. 2 guys, I said, I don't believe what I'm seeing. 2 guys with white bags and these big guns, the machine gun or Tommy guns, I guess you call them. They crawled out, climbs on the first coach. And I thought to myself, I better stay back here and out of the way, because everybody's going to be all upset, and I don't want to be up there. So anyway, when I get ahead of my story here, when this guy was telling me all this, I said to him, I said, that's no good, you tell the engineer. I said, because Once we stop and the neighbors around there see two guys with Tommy guns get on that engine, and I said, you're going to have every policeman within 50 miles be down here, and there's going to be chaos. I said, the OPP will be here, and the Windsor police, and everybody else. He said, no, they won't. No, they won't. I said, well, they will be. And he said, no, the chief's on board. The chief of the Windsor police on board, and the commissioner from the OPP, or maybe not the commissioner, but the head honcho on the OPP. They all know about it. So he said, and I said, well, I said, who else knows? Oh, he says, the judges, there's judges on there, and there's lawyers, and there's all the top people of Windsor and area rode that train, because it cost $100 a ticket. And they went in and had their dinner in this club, and then this is included in the $100. And then they ride the train 15 miles out and 15 miles back, which maybe take an hour and a half. And all the money that they got or made on that train went towards the hospital in Windsor. And then when they robbed the train, two guys climbed on the first coach, and they had pillowcases, and they walked down with all the people and said, all right, you better make a donation, either that or we'll take your rings or whatever. So everybody would throw in $50 or $20 or, depending how much they could afford. And these people were quite well to do on this train. So I think, I don't know, I was told whether this is true or not. The guys, they collected up about $10,000, and which was turned over to the hospital, plus the money that they got on the coach. I don't know how much they got for riding that coach. But anyway, they had a fantastic time, and everybody enjoyed themselves. That was a little episode with number 9.
Well, tell us a bit more about your working days. You started as train crew, as a brakeman. What other jobs did you have on the rail? And tell us a bit about being a brakeman.
About the what?
About being a brakeman. You started as a trainman or a brakeman.
Okay, it's the same thing.
And tell us a bit about your duties there, and what other jobs you had on the Wabash.
Okay. Well, on the Wabash, they had brand new diesels. This is 1954. And the diesels they changed over from steam to diesels in 53 and 54. So I got on just in changing over. So all the diesels we had then, what they call them covered wagons, they're like brand new Cadillacs, compared to a steam engine.
Were they F7s?
Beg pardon?
F7s, is that what they started with?
No, just like that covered wagon we got out there.
Okay.
We call them a covered wagon, just like a passenger engine. And the Wabash bought 26 of them. And I go to work the way I am right now. You didn't have to heck of a lot of work. You didn't have to do a lot of setting off and picking up. It was pretty well a straight shot to Fort Erie, and it was a pretty easy job, at least I thought. So anyway, until I got, when they needed men down on a swing job in Niagara Falls, which was an outpost job that worked 7 days a week. And all the senior men, they didn't want to be away from home. They didn't want to work 7 days a week. I'm just a young guy. I'm 20 years old, 21. So I go down there with all the crew was young. We went down there and worked 7 days a week, and they would the management and the railway, they would say they would let you book off 2 or 3 days a month, to book off and send a relief down to relieve you. So you get 2 or 3 days a month home, the rest of the time you're working. It was the best paid job in the railroad at that time, and we were down there 3 or 4 years until the Norfolk and Western, I guess it was, bottom out. And the average train when the Wabash had it would be 55 to 65 cars. That would be an average train, and they'd fly it up and down the track 50 mile an hour or more. And when the Norfolk and Western bottom out, Norfolk and Western never run 60-car trains. They run 100 and 115, 120. They doubled the trains. So therefore, they only needed half the crews. So if there was 150 trainmen, that's conductors and brakemen, they only, when they got through, there was only 75, so everybody needed, half the men were laid off. So when we got laid off, when I got laid off the Wabash, I was off for 2 or 3 months, and then we got a phone call, at least I did, and so did a lot of the other fellas laid off, because we had 7 or 8 years service. Said the Conrail, not the Conrail, it was a New York Central. This is in 1961. The New York Centrals were looking for men. They want to hire 50 men down in Windsor right away. My boss in the Wabash phoned me and told me this, and he said, if you want to go down, do you want the job? And if you do, we'll put your name down. And I said, yeah, I'd like to have it. So they said there's a passenger train running out of the Castle station on the New York Central. It's going to Windsor. So we got on the train at about 9 o'clock in the morning, about 50 of us, and laid off men from the CNO and the Wabash. We get down to Windsor. As soon as we got off the passenger train, we went down to the yard office, and they said to us, all you guys that are going to work on the railroad here, come on in. We got to have the rule exam. We got to have an eye test and everything, the formality. Now, unknowing to us, they'd already had all our rule books and everything that we wrote. So we were there for 4 hours. We got classified, eye exam and rule exam, and there was whole works. Everything was all done officially. And then after we got that all done, the fellow, the instructor and the train master down there said, I got to have 15 men for the afternoon shift and another 15 men at night, because what they wanted is hump riders. Now in Windsor, they got a hump yard. I don't know whether you know what a hump yard is.
I do, but could you explain what a hump yard is, please?
Yeah, hump yard is, the yard looks like a bowl. Maybe it's 50 feet. The hump is like a hill. It's maybe 50 feet high, and it comes up to a hump like this. An engine will get on to say 50 cars, and you shove them 50 cars up the hill real slow. And there's a building up there, a shanty or whatever you want to call it, and there's usually 15 or 20 hump riders in there. And what they do, once they went over the hump, down in the yard, the outgoing yard, there'd be 20 yard tracks. And the cars that you're humping in, some cars maybe had to go to different areas so they have to go into different tracks. So they have switch tenders down the leads, on 2 leads. And as they push the car, each one of them cars would go all over, But they'd shove them up over the hill, and a guy would get on, a hump rider would crawl up the ladder, and the brake was usually up in the top on a boxcar. And you had what you call a hump club. It would be 36 inches long, and you had a stem winder here, you put on the old brakes. And what you'd do, you'd crawl up there, and you'd put your club in, and you tighten the brake up, and you tighten it right up till the wheels damn near skid, and that would give the slack to the hump conductor down below. Once he got, because the cars were just dropped over the hill, and the slack is out tight. When the slack's tight, he can't pull the pin. But when you put the brake on, and the slack runs in, he knows you got control of the cars. He pulls the pin, and you got a hold of 4 cars. You got to ride those cars down that hill, because down that hill going to beat hell. And this is even at night too. And you go down in there, and you'd be looking over the cars, and you'd have the hump club, and you'd be riding that car, and you'd take the cars down the hill, and you'd couple them onto some cars down in the track, and you're supposed to only couple them 2 to 4 miles an hour to make the joint. And most of the time, that's the speed, you'd control them. Now, they wouldn't hire no hump riders unless they had 5 years experience on the railway. Because if you took a man off the street that had no railroad experience and put him up there as a hump rider, he'd be dead in 24 hours because, he just couldn't handle it. He got to have, it takes a lot of experience. So we rode the cars in the hump for a year, And then finally Detroit built a new electronic hump yard, and then they humped all the cars over in Detroit rather than Windsor, so they laid all the men off. There had to be 100 men up there, and anyway, once we got laid off, then the CNR, they were always looking for men with experience. So then once we got laid off, went back home, we'd get a phone call in a couple of months saying, "You want a job in the CNR on the train crews?" And we'd go over and write the rules and the whole thing. We go to work in the CNR. Well, when I went to work in the CNR, I ended up going to work down in Fort Erie until until I got a chance to bump up to book into London and work out of London. And once I got on the CNR, then I stayed on there, and I stayed on there for about 32 years until I retired.
And you were brakeman on
Oh, no.
CNR, or what were you doing on CNR?
Oh no, what you do, you hire on as a brakeman, and after you're on a couple of years, and you had the opportunity to write, which is a whole new set of rules, and take examinations and become a conductor.
Okay.
So then you get qualified as a conductor. Well, after you're on a railroad for 2 or 3 years, you were expected, or you were more or less had to do it. You got classified as a conductor. You went through the whole process. Maybe take you 3 or 4 days, to do all your exams and whatever. And then once you become a conductor, you'd still work as a brakeman, but when they needed a conductor, you went out and run the train. You were in control of the train, because usually the conductors were the senior men on the railroad. And eventually, as you worked your way up, after a few years, and you'd get all the shit jobs as a conductor. And then eventually you get the good jobs. And I used to think the real good jobs, at least I enjoyed them, as a conductor on the passenger trains, or even the brakeman on the passenger trains. I mean, I really enjoyed it, and they paid you for it.
And what runs were you doing in those days?
Well, I basically on passenger work would be pretty well off the spare board. At least I was qualified as a passenger conductor. That was another qualification. So when they needed a passenger conductor, there were certain guys on the spare board that were qualified. So they'd call you in, say you got 2 hours to get over at the station in London. The conductor coming in just booked sick, or he's not feeling well, or whatever. And when he'd pull a train, come into London, you'd be there, you'd have all your train orders and whatever, and he'd come off, and you talk to him, and then he'd tell you what he had to be, what he had done, and then you'd control it from there on to Toronto.
How is the difference conducting a freight train from a passenger train from a freight train?
Oh, there's no comparison.
So what are the duties of the two? Explain the duties of the two conducting.
In a freight service, and a way freight was the one that you had to do all the work. It was a workhorse of the railroad. You every time you went to a town, you'd pick up loads and set the empties back in where the loads come out, and then you'd put them on your train. You go to the next town, like Elmer. You do the carnation plant, on the cooperative plant, and the tobacco plant. That'd be take an hour or two to do that, do their switching. And then you go from there, you'd go to Tillsonburg. You go into Tillsonburg, and you'd had Livingston, and there's 3 or 4 plants. You do the same thing at Tillsonburg. Then you go on to Cortland, and then there's another place. Then you go on further on down, and you go down as far as Cayuga. That's 60 or 70 miles down. Then you go down there, down to Cayuga. Yeah, that's as far as you used to go, and then you'd reverse your train, and then you'd come back to St. Thomas with your train. You'd done most of the work going down. The odd time you did 1 or 2 jobs on the way home. It was usually an 8 to 10 hour a day on the way freight. And you're working all the time. You earned your money there. Then on the freight usually, say, would run out of London, and the freight train would come in out of Windsor, maybe it'd be the auto train, they call 476. It would come in and they'd change crews in London, and you'd get on it, and you might set a few cars off, pick a few cars up out of London, double on your train, get your air tested and whatever, and then you're on your way. If you're lucky, you didn't have no set-offs or pickups, and you should fly right into Toronto on a freight train, which is not too bad. The odd time, maybe you'd make 1 or 2 set-offs, but not too often. That was on a better train. Then some of the other trains, used to call a milk train, it would go down and it would maybe make 4 or 5 set-offs and pickups on the way to Toronto, but it wasn't really that bad. You only worked a couple hours on it, but you had to, you had to watch the train all the time, because you'd have hot boxes and dragging equipment and God only knows what. Anyway, that's the difference there. And then on passenger, when you went on the passenger train, you usually had a uniform on you. If you were called out as a brakeman, then you put on a brakeman's, which almost the same thing, but you didn't have all the bars on your sleeve. And you went out as a brakeman. With a brakeman, all you did is looked after the passengers. Usually, you help the conductor pick up the tickets, and you say you leave London, and you went from London. You go to Woodstock, and then you'd maybe have 10 people get off at Woodstock, and 5 would get on, and you'd look after them, and you'd go on. The next shot would be Brantford. And you'd be the same thing. You'd have a number on and off. Another one, you go down to be Oakville, on and off. The brakeman would usually handle that. And then you'd fly into Toronto. And then the brakeman and the conductor would unload all the passengers and then walk through the coaches to make sure the people didn't leave anything in there. If they did, you picked it up and you took it down to the operator or the baggage man, and you turned it over to him, because those people are going to come back and say, "Oh, I left my purse or I left my bag." They'd say, "Here it is." And that was a pretty easy job.
So, I mean, the conductor's in charge of the train, so you're...
That's correct.
So you're technically above the engineers. Do they actually listen to your orders, or how would you...
Well...
How would that interaction take place?
Well, I would really would have. The conductor called the shots. Now the engineer is in charge of the engine. He controlled the engine, he's in charge of the engine. If he's got to stop, he's got to stop for whatever reason. Or if he's told to stop, he's got to stop. Whatever. The engineer, the old saying was, the engineer would say, you'd go up there and you'd maybe, if the conductor and the engineer weren't getting along, the conductor would go up and tell the engineer, "I want you to do this now." And the engineer would say to him, "I'm the engineer, my authority is from that drawbar to that drawbar. Your authority is from those coaches back. Now what did you want?" So as long as it controlled the coaches at the back end, that's the conductor's job. But you can't be telling the engineer his job. He'd tell you where to go. Okay. So that was the difference. But the conductor basically was in charge. If something went wrong, then that conductor, that's the guy that had to answer for it, along with the engineer. But anyway.
So, it's a brakeman or a conductor. What sort of things going wrong were you looking for, and what sort of things did go wrong?
Well, if you're on a freight, in the early times, you used to have friction bearings. That's brass on top and the bottom, on the waste down in the journal box. On the car motor, put oil in there, and that'd keep the bearing going. It was a brass bearing. Well, quite often, the waste or whatever reason would get in underneath the brass, and it would cause a hot box. And the bearing would get hot, like red hot, and then the waste and the oil would catch fire. And every time in a freight train, every time you went around the curve, the brakeman, it was his job to roll the window down on the diesel, stick his head out, and watch the train coming around the curve. And he'd watch all the wheels and everything else he'd watch the whole train come around on the engine. He'd be watching all the way around. And the brakeman on the tail end, would be on the caboose, and he'd do the same thing. He'd watch the tail end half, and you'd watch it. And if there was anything wrong back there on a curve, you could see it. You'd either see smoke flying or sparks flying or whatever. And if you seen smoke flying, you get stopped. You tell the engineer, bring the train to a stop. We got a hot box, or we got something dragging up there, sparks flying. You'd bring the engine to a stop, and maybe you'd walk back, maybe half the train or wherever, and whatever was wrong, you'd fix it. It could be a drag and brake beam, hanging down, riding on the rail. That's not very good, because it could put you on the ground. So you'd look after that. And then another thing now that didn't happen very often. Your hot boxes, that didn't happen very often. Maybe 1 out of every 20 trips you'd have something like that. But you'd have to look after it. If it was a hot box, you'd have to put it out and whatever, and if you'd see how hot it was and whatever. And if it was a hot box, then the next siding you set that car off into the siding. You tell the dispatcher, and they'd have the carman down fix it. And then the next train come along to pick it up and take it on its way. Or another thing quite often happened. You'd be sailing through the country, and all of a sudden your train would go in an emergency. And you look back, you'd always wonder what the hell happened, because you're liable to find your train all over the fields, because your train just broke apart, and when you lose the air pressure, the train goes into emergency. The whole train grinds right to a halt. So as soon as you ground to an emergency, you'd look out the door and whatever, and make sure your train's all still on the track. And if it was, you'd kind of breathe a little easier. And then you'd go up. If your train was, you could see if the train was off the track or whatever. You could usually see it. And if it was all on the track, then you'd grab a hose bag out of the engine on a big long pipe wrench, and you'd start back to the train, and you'd check every car. And usually what happened, a rubber hose bag would blow up. And when, the train run with 70 pounds pressure in the airline, and usually you could run 60 to 70 pounds air in a freight train, would be in the train line. And if the air reduced quickly, 10 or 15 pounds, or 20 pounds, or it would go from 70 to nothing, then the train went in emergency. Is there time up?
Nope. I'm just trying to gauge what we're trying to. I get lost in the story, so I don't know how long we go. But
okay.
And I want to ask a few more questions, so I want to time myself on this. We had John Hibbert in earlier today, and he was talking about living in the caboose.
Yep.
You had similar?
Oh, well, I spent hundreds of days living in the caboose.
Well, tell me, his view on what living in a caboose life was like. I'd like to hear what was like living, sleeping, and dealing with the other guys on a caboose.
Yeah, in the caboose there'd be 3 men, the conductor and 2 brakemen. He had 3 bunks in there, and they were hard, just almost like the cement floor. They were horse-haired mattresses, as they called them. And usually every brakeman, if you had a regular job, you'd have your own sleeping bag and your own pillow. And at the other end of the road, when it come time, when you pulled into, say, Fort Erie, the head end brakeman would cut the engine off or take the engine to the shop, and then he'd walk back, and he'd walk the length of the train back to the caboose to say this is 1 o'clock in the morning, or could be any time. You get that?
Yeah.
Oh, I can't. Did I pull that apart? If you've been on the road coming on a trip, you could be 6 or 8 hours, running over the country, so you haven't had enough to eat. You go back to the caboose, and usually the conductor and your other brakeman would have dinner on the stove. They'd have a real nice. You could cook fantastic dinners on them coal stoves. they'd have maybe, even it depended, if you sometimes you ate soup, sometimes you eat steak. It depended, but anyway, you go back there and you could eat. You'd usually bring your own food with you. And when head end brakeman got back there, the other two guys would maybe have the table set or whatever. You didn't have to do an awful lot. But, because the head guy up in the head end, he usually done a lot of the work. The other two fellas sit back in the caboose. They'd watch the train, going. And if you run into a problem, they'd fix it. You'd go to sleep in them damn cabooses. You'd get used to it, and you'd sleep in the caboose maybe 6 or 8 hours, or until they called you for the return trip home. In the summertime, it was always too damned hot, and in the wintertime, it was always too cold. But you would stoker the little coal stove up, and the conductor, usually he had his bunk was next to the fire, and the two brakemen was on one at each end. That was next to the outside doors. So usually the conductor, was his job to keep that fire going, And if you started getting cold and he was asleep, and you go up and fix it, or throw more coal on there or whatever. But yeah, the caboose was you had a lot of good times in the caboose, You had fantastic dinners sometime. One day we were riding on a swing job, or a Niagara Falls swing job, and we had a Jeep, what they call a Jeep. It wasn't, anyway, there was a footboard on the front, and we drive down through Stanford from Welland Junction into Niagara Falls, 15-mile run. We'd run down through there. We'd run through a lot of woods and whatever, and there was all kinds of pheasants. One day we were booting her down through there going back home to Niagara Falls after doing a lot of work, and I was on the engine, and all bang, a pheasant flew up, and we hit the front of the engine, and the pheasant, we quite often you'd hit a pheasant or something. So I never thought any more of it. We got into Niagara Falls, and I cut the engine off, and I looked, and there's the pheasant laying on the footboard. And I picked it up and looked at it, and other than it was dead, it was still in one piece. So the conductor's coming up, and I said, "Do you ever eat pheasant?" "Oh yeah, lots of times." I said, "Here's one here. I take it home, take it home for your dinner." And he looked it over, and he said, "Yeah." I said, "We just hit it about 4 or 5 miles outside of town." So he put it in a bag, and he took it home. Come back that night, this is where we're living in the caboose. And he come back, and it come dinner time, he said, "I got that pheasant," and he had it all roasted, and just like Christmas dinner, and it was delicious. So we'd have a lot, or you would have a steak, and they had a little grill, and they take a steak, and you get the fire, just a nice red coals. You'd open up the door, you'd put the steak in like a toaster, and you'd put your mitts on so you didn't burn your fingers, and you'd hold it in there, and turn it over until you just got it perfect. Then you'd have that and beans. That was your dinner. Fantastic. So that's it.
Good. Anything else you'd like to tell? I mean,
No.
what do you think of it? Anything you can?
What about family?
Yes, your relatives that were working on. You had a few relatives working on the railroad.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit. Your father setting you up for those jobs and things.
Okay, well.
Tell us a bit about the.
Okay, well, my dad, like I told you, he worked for the New York Central. He hired on in 1922, and he worked till he was 64 or whatever. He had 40 years on the railroad. And anyway.
What did he do?
Oh, he was at work on a track maintenance. Maintenance away, you used to call it. Making sure that their tracks were good. Mm-hmm. They were the guys that kept their trains on the tracks.
That must have been very heavy in those days.
It was a hard job.
Because they're calling the ties by hand.
Yeah, that's right. Everything was done by hand. It was unbelievable. Anyway, that's a terrible job. So, he had that job, and all where I lived over here on Jonah Street where the sports club is. There was an old house there. I lived in the house. My dad just had to walk down to Ross Street, and that's where he went to work. And all the houses in the whole area, every house in the whole area, everybody worked in the railroad. And right next door to me was a guy named George Moyes. He worked in the stores department. He was an assistant foreman or one of the foremen. And when I grew up there, I was born and raised in that house next to the Moyes. And I used to help old George Moyes, cut the grass or rake the lawn. This is when I'm 8 or 10 years old and whatever. So when I become 16, he said to me, because I'd always get a job delivering ice or some hard job, he'd say, "What are you going to do this winter? What are you going to do this summer?" And I'd say, "Well, I don't know. I haven't got a job yet." And he said, "Well, why don't you get a job? Well, either how are you going to hire some men over at the stores department?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, are they?" And he said, "Yeah, go on over there and ask them." He said, "The guy's name is Tinlin." That was the superintendent of the... "Go and talk to him." He said, "Usually they hire a man or two. Go and talk to him." And he said, "All right." So I goes over there, and with a hat in my hand, and I didn't know what to expect, and I tell him who it was. And he gets out, his secretary gets out the forms and asks me all these questions, and I tell her, "What school do you go to?" And well, I went on and on. But she never asked me my age. I was only 16, and you're supposed to be 18. So they never asked me, I never said. So anyway, I worked there that summer, and I worked that summer up until I was coming close to the 1st of September, and we're sitting around the dinner table, and I'm making about 15 cents less than my dad's making. And my dad been on the railroad 30 years or more, and he's making $1.65 an hour, and I'm making $1.50. And I think, I had more money than I knew what to do with. 16 years old, because $1 was worth a lot of money then. So he'd say to me, "You're going back to school?" I say, "Oh, no, I'm not going back." "Oh," he said, "I want you back to school." "No, I'm not going." I said, "I'm going to stay in the railroad." I said, "No, I'm going to stay in the railroad." So "I want you to school." "You can go in the railroad anytime." I said, "No." So anyway, come 1st of September, they'd call me in the office and say, "Oh, you're laid off. You're laid off, and you're laid off, and when you go back to school, and you come back next year, and maybe we might have another job." So I grumbled, and I didn't say okay. I think, "Oh God, I got laid off," because there was all kinds of work to do. So I go back to school, and the next year, the same thing had happened, but this time I went over a job over at the freight shed. I worked over there until September, and my dad would say, "You're all done. You're going to go to school." "Oh no, I'm staying there." So anyway, I get laid off. So anyway, I went to the work in the Wabash. I got my own job in the Wabash in 1953. About 15 years later, I'm sitting around talking to my dad about the railroad, and I said, "God, I couldn't figure out. They were busier than hell, and then all of a sudden they call me in and tell me I'm laid off." He said, "Yeah, I know." I said, "Well, I wonder why they did." He said, "Because I told them to." So, So the next day, when I went to work in the Wabash, I thought, I'll get my job myself, and then maybe you won't have the influence. So that's what I did. My uncle, Gus Colville, worked on the Wabash as a conductor, and I had another cousin who was a great big guy. His name was Harold Lawrence. He worked as a brakeman or a conductor, but he was working as a brakeman. They were already working. And then there was another fella I knew over there very, very well. He was a master mechanic, or rode 4 engines and a master mechanic. His name was Harry Shipp. And anyway, when I went over there to get a job, they told me they wasn't hiring, and 2 or 3 days later they called me up and said, "Come on, talk to us." So I went over there, and I got a job. I didn't realize it, but they said something, and they gave me a job. I was only, I think it was 18 or 19 years old. And then after that, when I worked, I told you the rest of the story. But anyway, it's been a real good life. I enjoyed it.
Good.
And then when I was over here, once I retired, even before I retired, I was hooked up with a museum because we brought the 5700 in and whatever. And then after retired, then I had to go to work. I worked like hell building it, and I helped build that number 9. But anyway.
Well, I've said that if I could snap my fingers and put all the machinery back in the Ford plant, I'd have a hard time getting the factory workers to go back there and do their job. But if I did the same here, you'd have a bunch, the railway men would come and do their,
Yeah.
they retired, and then pretty much, you, Farnsworth, Parsons, Barrow, pretty much showed up doing
Oh yeah, well they all.
the same thing that you had been doing.
Yeah, they liked what they did. I always used to think, if a man likes the job he's doing, it's easy.
And just a bit of trivia, because I don't know it. What year was the freight shed torn down?
Oh gosh, let me see. 53. It'd be around 65 or 70 in that era.
Okay.
There used to be the freight shed would be there, and it was a going concern. And then right next to the freight shed, just over a little bit, was a cattle yard, a cattle pens.
So you remember the cattle pens being
Yes.
over there?
Oh, I'll tell you what we did when we were 10 or 11 years old. Like I say, I grew up with a whole bunch of boys in here. All my life I lived right around the ballpark, and there ain't nothing we didn't do. So when we were maybe 9, 10, 11 years old, we'd go roaming around. We'd go over there with that cattle stock pen, is where they'd unload cars, and put it in the stock pen till the farmers come and pick it up. So quite often what we'd do, we'd go over there and there'd be sheep, big sheep, and we were only about 8, 9 years old. And we'd just ride the sheep. This is on a Sunday. There's nobody around. We climb in the pen, and we'd run and jump on the sheep, hang right on, and the sheep would be bounced. The next thing we go flying through the air, and we think that was a hell of a good time.
Sheep rodeo.
Yeah, until the law come along and said, "Get the hell out of here."
Well, I made a short film about it, just past the anniversary, but in 1915, 2 Americans showed up on July 4th, and with orders from the Germans to blow up that stockyard and to plant.
I never ever heard that. Oh, I guess I did hear something about it years and years.
There was no bomb because the guy he had some dynamite.
Yeah.
He chickened out and he threw it in the Detroit River before he crossed the border.
Yeah.
And he put a couple of bricks in and they just kind of faked the whole thing. They like getting paid by the Germans. They're getting paid $300 to be secret agents.
I think.
But their idea was to blow up a shipment of horses that were coming from the west. They were supposed to be dropped off here. I'm not sure what a suitcase full of dynamite really was going to do to the horses. It was going to kill a few of them, I guess, and maybe stampede something. But so the stockyards were kind of Van Pelt's area, like.
Well, it was a stockyard was a drop-off point.
No, but I'm talking about the position of them, kind of where the old Canadian Tire where Van Pelt's is that?
In that, yeah. Well,
on the other side, or is it further east still?
I'm trying to. I think it might have been just east of that, just east. There was the freight shed, which would be down over here,
I
and then
see the pictures of, I can see what it is.
okay. Well, you can if you could see the freight shed, you should be able to almost look over and see the stockyard. But all the stockyard was just a big pen, and maybe you could put 30 or 40 cows in there. And what they would do, I think this is what they would do. The cars, the cattle car would come in from the west, maybe in the fall, because they didn't want to keep them all winter. They'd bring them in here, steers or whatever you call them, and they'd unload them into the stock pen. And the farmers around here would, order them or buy them or whatever. And they'd bring in basically steers or cows or whatever, and you're liable to have 30 or 40 cows in the pen that would be unloaded from the stock cars. Or there could be the other way around. Maybe farmers are loading stock cars and they're going somewhere else. But I never ever seen any horses in that stock
Well, it must have
yard.
been a bigger thing because there was between 200 and 250 horses supposed to be in this pen.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
this is the wartime, so I think they, they changed.
yeah, well, I think there was different pins, like there was a pin that would hold 30 or 40, and maybe beside it was another pin to hold 30 or 40.
It wasn't all so built up as it is now. So
Yeah, well, when we were in there, when 10 years old, I'd be about 10 years old, 45, 40, 44, or whatever. And yeah, we'd go down there and raise hell down there on the stockyard. Well, but it's a wonder we didn't get killed. Or another thing, I seen some of the guys, there'd be a bull in there, and they'd say, "Let me see you get down in there and out before that bull gets you." And a couple of guys would climb down the fence, and the bull stamping, they just charging and up over the fence. I thought when I grew up, one of them guys ever slipped, they would be dead. We were just kids.
Yeah, well, we did some funny things around the tracks as well.
Oh, I know. Yeah, they used to.
Is there anything else to say, Hugh? Anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, there's maybe one other.
Oh, please.
There's one other little story.
Please.
When I was on the Wabash, I was coming out. I was a brakeman, and I was on the head end riding in the diesel. This is we had about at the Wabash. Then they had about 55 cars. We come out of Fort Erie, and we're booting across the country doing about. We come to Welland Junction. That's 18 miles out of Fort Erie. Then you come to Welland Junction, and usually you'd come to Welland Junction, you'd have to quite often either stop and get your train orders to continue on to St. Thomas, or you'd slow down 3 or 4 miles an hour, and the operator would hoop the orders onto the train. So quite often down around Welland Junction, they had a little bit of a woods around there. And they used to call Knights of the Road or hobos or whatever you want. They used to ride up and down the Wabash just like the passenger service, but they rode in the boxcars. So I, just young at the time, I knew when I was working on the swing job, I see them, the hobos or whatever you want to call them, over there around in the woods, where they have 45-gallon drum with a fire going, trying to keep warm or whatever. But in the summertime, I was on a brakeman coming out of Fort Erie. We stopped at Welland Junction to pick up orders. This is where the hobos would get on the train, because they're going to Windsor or St. Thomas or wherever. So anyway, I think we come by there, we may be going 3 or 4 miles an hour, and got our orders, and away we go. And once we get over the canal, we just widen on it and go like hell, 50 miles an hour. So we come down on the first big curve, or maybe down around Cougar, one of the curves there, great big long curve. I looked and back, looking at the train, I'm watching the wheels, and I look up on the roof, and here's a guy sitting up on the roof, sitting there, and we're doing 50 miles an hour, and he's hanging on, he's sitting up there, and oh my God, there's a guy sitting on the roof. Normally they get down in the boxcars or down inside of a gun, but apparently this guy must have got on at the last minute, and there was a boxcar, and we're picking up speed, so we climbed up the ladder. He's got to go somewhere, so we kept right on going. He goes up on the roof. So we're going like hell, going through the country, and the guy's there used to be a wooden cat rock up on the roof, and he's got a hold of the cat rock, and he's up there like this, and I could see him wobbling around there, and we're going like hell. It must have been windy. And I said to the engineer, going around the curve, I said, "Oh my God, look back there." I said, "There's a man up there on the roof." I said, "One of them guys got on Welland Junction." So one of them hobos is up there, and he said, "Did he fall off?" I said, "No, he's hanging on." He said, "Well, let him hang on. I hope the hell he hangs on till he gets to St. Thomas." I said, "We should stop, let him off." "Oh," he said, "don't even look back there." He said, "Don't look up there." He said, "We don't even know he's there." He said, if he gets off in St. Thomas, fine. If he don't get off in St. Thomas, well, I hope he jumped off some big grass or something. We pulled into St. Thomas, and the guy crawled down. Away he went over with a golf course. They used to ride, the hobos used to ride them trains. Often you'd see them on them trains.
Well, just north, I've heard so that just north of the tracks, just to the northwest of your yard, like the Wabash yard, in the woods there,
Yeah.
It was like a mini city in the Depression, like in the 30s.
In St. Thomas.
In St. Thomas,
Yeah.
there was hundreds of guys living out there because the Wabash
Yeah.
was a very handy transportation route, and that was close to the tracks, enough out of the way that nobody was getting arrested for it anymore. They would have
No,
loved to have
no,
gotten-
no,
they would have loved to have gotten arrested because they would have gotten some food and some
Yeah,
help.
no, nobody bothered them. When I was on the swing job, we used to like work out of Welland Junction, picking cars up, going here, there, and wherever. And I used to work the night job a lot. Maybe you go to work at 7 o'clock at night, get done 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And we had a real good conductor with us, an old conductor, lived in Niagara Falls. And the other guy I was with, his name was Oldham, Clarence Oldham. And he's about my age, and we were in our 20s. And one day we're standing around there. I guess it was in the fall. And I said to him, "Look at over there." I said, "There's a hell of a fire in the middle of that woods." So we said to the conductor, "Look at the fire in the woods." He said, "That's not a fire." He said, "That's their hobos where they're resting." He said, in there they got a fire going. That's where they cook their dinner. So anyway, we had to wait for an hour for a train, and I said to my mate, "What do you say we go over there and see what kind of a fire they got?" So we had our lights and whatever, and I said, we see them on the train. So I walked over there, 2 of us, and we were about 4 or 5 and sitting around over there, and they were cooking hot dogs or whatever over the fire, and they knew who we were. But they said, "Oh, you guys are working on the swing job." They knew the job better than we did. So they said, "You want hot dogs?" No. We just went and looked around, and they had a little leaves and whatever, like a little bed, cardboard to lay down on. And that's where they used to, and even some of them had a couple pieces of tarp, and they crawl down on whatever grass and pull the tarp over them and go to sleep. And the hobos are the, whatever you want to call them.
That reminds me from King of the Road, the song.
Yep.
I know every engineer on every train, all their
Yep.
children and all their names. So.
Yep, that's right. Those guys, they knew when the trains were coming. They knew how they knew, I don't know, but they knew when the trains were right. They even knew the numbers of the trains. And I thought, my God, because it's all they done is ride back and forth. I think I told you enough.
All right. Well, thank you very much.